All right, so good afternoon, and thank you for coming here on this gloomy Friday afternoon. It feels like fall, and actually fall is coming officially, I think, tomorrow?
Today, I think.
Today? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, but actually it arrived earlier than that, but officially today. And here, of course, I want to welcome you to this book lounge. So, Fiscal Federalism and Equalization Policy in Canada is the third book in our Johnson Shoyama series with University of Toronto Press. And I would like to welcome you, and we have all the co-authors of the book here. So I'm Daniel Bélan from the Johnson Shoyama School. Here you have André Lecourt from University of Ottawa, Rose Alford, also from Johnson Shoyama. Also from Johnson Shoyama, of course, we have Hai-Jun Mu. And formerly from Johnson Shoyama, now at the University of Toronto, we have Greg Marchildon. Hello, Greg.
Hello.
And so all the team is there together. So I want to tell you a few things. We won't talk for that long. This is a social event, social gathering. But I want to tell you a few things about the book in general, and then each of my co-authors will discuss a bit some of the contributions of this book. So, equalization is not a very exciting topic for most people because it's quite complex. The equalization formula, at least, is complex, and it's also a contentious issue. If you've been following the news out of Alberta, where there's the leadership race for the new United Conservative Party in Alberta. You've heard maybe of what Jason Kenney and Brian Jean have said about equalization recently. So very critical here perspective on equalization. Our Premier, Brad Wall, has also criticized some aspect of the equalization program on social media and beyond. Of course, that's the discourse you hear mainly in provinces that don't receive equalization. Don't currently receive equalization. Alberta actually hasn't received equalization since the early 1960s, only a few years after the program was created in 1957. So there is a different, of course, perspective. If you go to Quebec City, you go to Winnipeg, you go to Halifax, of course, provinces that have received equalization for a very long time, where there is strong support for the program. So this is a political issue, contentious issue, but it's also a major issue from an economic and fiscal standpoint. We talk about, and that's why it's so controversial, because we talk about $18 billion last year of money that goes only to provinces that fall under a certain average in terms of fiscal capacity. And so the equalization, so this year actually equalization will be received by 6 provinces, but there are 4 that don't receive any. But the money doesn't come from these provinces that don't receive money. It comes from all provinces, all taxpayers, because it's financed out of the general revenues of the federal government. So all Canadians pay for it. As you may know, the equalization is also embedded in the 1982 Constitutional Act. At least the idea of equalization, but there is no discussion about how the formula should work, how we should include natural resource revenues, both renewable and non-renewable resources. And so there is a lot of debate about issues that may seem technical, but that in fact are about billions and billions of dollars, which is why it's so controversial, because there is a lot of money at stake. So what we did in this book is that we really have here an interdisciplinary team. We have a political sociologist, a political scientist, 2 economists, and, well, a former practitioner and an economic historian, Greg. And so we decided to really offer a critical overview of equalization. Actually, there is no such a thing. There is no book that you can find, a short book on equalization, a general historical, political, economic introduction to equalization. It just doesn't exist. So it's just that it fills a gap, but also I think it's a useful book for people who just want to know about equalization. A good thing about this book, it's short, 132 pages. Who wants to read 500 pages or 400 pages about equalization? Raise your hand if you want to. Oh, you do? Okay. I will send you some.
We'll prepare another one for you.
We'll prepare another one for you. Very good. So it's a concise book, and it covers really different dimensions: political, historical, economic dimensions. And it offers critical perspectives and also policy recommendations about the future of equalization. So now we'll let André tell us a bit about the politics of equalization, then we'll deal with Rose and the economics of equalization. Then we'll talk about another important aspect of this book, which is the discussion about the relationship between the equalization program and other aspects of fiscal federalism, mainly the health and social transfers. Actually, the Canada health transfer is actually bigger than equalization, and it's very important to understand equalization in the broader context of fiscal federalism. And then Greg will talk about the future of equalization and why it matters. So, André, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Daniel. So I'll just take my few minutes to talk about one of the questions we look at in the book, which is, why is there some inherent potential for politicization in equalization in Canada, right? Because we know that, we show that in our first chapter, that, in the early 2000s and the Martin years, the early Harper years, there were some fairly severe intergovernmental conflict around equalization, and arguably it's those types of years are an outlier. But what we say in the book is that the potential for equalization becoming quite heavily politicized is there, and it's there as a result of three or four things. The first thing is that, of course, in our country we have natural resources, right? And if we didn't, probably everything would be much calmer on the equalization front. But we have renewable and we have non-renewable natural resources. Of course, they're unevenly distributed territorially. When it comes to non-renewable resources, we know that the price is volatile, right? So it introduces some less than perfect predictability into what goes on equalization. Also, one of the points we make is that there's a symbolic value attached to natural resources in Canada, whereas whether it's oil and gas in the West or hydroelectricity in Manitoba and Quebec, this is something that's kind of politically sensitive. And some provinces, of course, find the constitutional provincial constitutional ownership of natural resources to be some kind of an argument that, in fact, the whole of the revenue stemming from the development of natural resources should belong to the provinces. So, again, the fact that there are natural resources, especially non-renewable natural resources in Canada, that are even unevenly distributed, is one first reason why there is some potential for politicizing equalization. Perhaps the most important reason is that the equalization program is administered directly by the federal government, right? So it's in the realm of politics. Provinces know that, there's ways for them to exercise leverage on the federal government about many things, including equalization. And in Canada's federalism, we know that provinces are powerful political actors. We know that provincial identities are strong. We know that Canadians, faced with a conflict between their province and the federal government, are very likely to support their province. So there's some ammunitions for provinces who want to challenge decisions on equalization, because these decisions are made by the federal government which can be politically or electorally sensitive, depending on the context, minority governments, for example. So I think there's a governance aspect to equalization that make it sensitive to politicization. And of course, we also talk about the book. We talk about the way the equalization program is discussed in Canada, in the media, in the public understandings of equalization. Of course, we don't expect that the public will have a sophisticated understanding of equalization, but there are some reference to the program in the media, which I think lead the public in what we think are wrong paths. For example, the notion that one province effectively gives money to another province is something we very often encounter in newspaper reporting, and something that I think, in our opinion, misrepresents the program. So there's some of these things that are kind of hard to play on if you want to reduce the level of politicization of the equalization program in Canada. Perhaps in the longer term, we can, maybe with books like these, we can work on a better understanding of the program, the uneven distribution of natural resources, and how much that can be done about that. But one of the things that we say is that perhaps we could consider an alternative mode of governance for the program. And there are equalization programs in many other federations. And in some federations, these programs are really governed by an arm's length agency. So we examined, for example, the Australian model, where there is Commonwealth's Grants Commission, which is led by politically independent commissioners, economists, specialists of various types, former civil servants. And this body in Australia makes recommendation on equalization payment to the Commonwealth government, as the federal government is called in Australia. And these recommendations do have the veneer of kind of legitimacy. It's seen as coming from kind of this technocratic, neutral body. And in effect, we think that it does a lot to depoliticize equalization. Now, whether we want or we can adapt such a model is kind of an open question. We know that institutional transfer is tricky. You can take an institutional model from one country, try to bring it to our own. Will it yield the same results? It's unclear. Australia is a different type of federalism. It's more centralized, less combative constituent units. So it's not a given that if we were to use an arm's length agency to manage our equalization program, that we'd be able to depoliticize it as much as the Australians, I think, have been able to do. But we think that's something that should be considered. Now, this being said, in the literature, there are people who believe that the equalization program is central to Canadian citizenship, and that from a democratic perspective, it should be administered by democratically elected people, therefore our federal government. So we recognize that argument, but I think we also see the merits in having such a program administered in a way that's perhaps less political than it's been or that it can be in the country. So I'll stop here on the politics of equalization.
Thank you very much, André. Rose?
I think most economists would be very quick to concede that most of the drivers of equalization program in Canada is really politics and expediency. However, there is an economic foundation for the equalization program or programs like it. The economic rationale for equalization payments is based or arises from differences in the province's income-raising capacities. In a country as large and diverse as Canada, it's no surprise that different provinces have different abilities to raise revenues. That can translate, and that changes over time. It hasn't changed that much in Canada, but there are some provinces that are at one period relatively well off and another period relatively less well off, as was the case for Ontario for a couple of years ago. That can translate into significant differences in the quantities and qualities of public services that those provinces can offer to their citizens across the provinces. The danger is that individuals and families may look at the package of public services that are available in different provinces and make their decisions about where they want to live and work based on the public services that are available, rather than being based on where their productivity is the highest or the employment rate is the highest. When that happens, we say there is fiscally induced migration. That is, people move themselves across provinces for the purpose of attaining better packages of public services rather than for employment and income purposes. That fiscally induced migration is a concern because it is inefficient. It will reduce the national income and production. The idea is that we could have a federal government with lots of revenue from all the provinces that could take some of those resources and redistribute that to the individual provinces in such a way that those inequalities in revenue of the provinces is reduced. So given that the provincial economies are by definition very different, we could nevertheless try to minimize the differences in government revenues through something like our equalization program. That's how it's supposed to happen. And then when we do that, we reduce or avoid that inefficient migration. So that's sort of the fundamental economic argument underlying equalization payments, and there are others. So that's the main question, relates to, would there in fact be this inefficient, fiscally induced migration in the absence of equalization payments? And then second, are equalization payments effective in stemming that or in reducing it? A second economic concern relates to the possible unintended side effects of an equalization payments program. And that question really is the cure worse than the disease? And it can be. There is a danger that equalization payments may, in fact, inhibit the very kind of mobility that is desirable, leading to supporting larger than ideal populations in provinces with very limited opportunities, for example. That is, the incentive to move in the direction of higher unemployment rates and higher productivity has been dampened by equalization payments. That's one potential problem. A second potential concern of an unintended side effect is that provincial governments can game the system, and they may behave so as to maximize their equalization payments take. I mean, they can change their own taxation rates and their own provincial government revenue sources. They could behave so as to maximize their equalization payments take, rather than focusing on managing their economies for the maximum health and economic growth. So that can be a concern. So the economics behind equalization payments is really, on the one hand, is the effect of the equalization payments is what is intended? Is it reducing that inefficient fiscally induced migration? And then the second part of the economics is really, in addition to those effects that we're most interested in, are there also some unintended negative effects that we need to be aware of? Because you could argue, and there have been papers that have demonstrated that there can be very little effect of equalization payments on migration, but it can do a lot of harm. So it's not just how does the program work, it's also where might it do harm, or what other things does it interfere with. So the chapter on the economics of equalization payments sort of walks through the review of those various arguments, and then introduces some empirical evidence, because it's never clear. If we were to test whether equalization payments do what they're supposed to do, ideally, from a scientific perspective, we would stop the world, hold everything else constant, and then experiment on these provinces by giving them more or less equalization payments. Well, that's frowned upon when your subjects are people, real people, and so you just don't do that. I mean, there are statistical techniques that are very good at approximating that, and there has been some very good work done on this question, but the results don't have a completely clear picture, of course, and more work is to be done. So the chapter reviews some of the empirical studies to date, and then identifies some of the outstanding problems and offers up some numbers for your perusal. So I think that's about it for mine.
Thank you, Rose. Haijun.
So just follow up with Rose's comment about whether we can test whether there's physically induced migration in absence of equalization. Well, I spent some time in Beijing last term for sabbatical, and the people deeply agree there is physically induced migration. Just look at Beijing, why people move there, because they have the best hospitals, because they have a lower standard to get into university, which is a big problem because there was no such regional equalization program in China. So Andre and Rose and Daniel talk about the history, politics, and economic implication of equalization. However, in order to evaluate fiscal federalism in Canada, it's important to look at all the federal transfers. So there are 3 major federal transfers to support province, not territory. territory has its own additional program called the Territory Financing Formula. 3 programs for the province only. For the province receive its equalization, Canada Health Transfer, and Canada Social Transfer. For those who are not familiar with the other 2 transfers, these are conditional transfers which target on specific spending area, such as healthcare, education, and social assistance. So in fact, like what Daniel said, equalization has $18 billion. Canada Health Transfer in 2015 has almost $64 billion, so more than 3 times the size of equalization. And so equalization is a small component in this federal transfer system compared with other, particularly Canada Health Transfer. So it's important to put this transfer together because equalization has a limit, a small size, and also equalization doesn't consider all the aspects of equalization. It focuses on only the tax capacity of different of a province. It doesn't address any of the difference in the expenditure needs of a province. So far, we don't have any program which takes into account both the tax capacity difference and expenditure needs. So we'll in our policy scenario, we'll talk about a possible change to the transfer system. Will address this difference. So why we have to put this transfer together when we're evaluating the federal fiscal federalism system? The second reason is this transfers share 2 joint objectives. They have 2 objectives. The first one is to reduce the fiscal gap between federal government and other provincial governments. The federal government collects more tax dollars than is required, and the province collect lower tax revenue than is required to funding healthcare education. So all the transfers putting together try to reduce this fiscal gap. From provincial perspective, actually, all the provincial, like Greg would tell you this, from province perspective, all the transfers actually flow into the general revenue funds of provincial governments. So once they are in the funds, you don't see much of difference among the transfers. So any change to one transfer will affect the expenditure capacity, spending capacity of the province on almost every program. Second, all the transfers actually are redistributive, not only equalization. Before 2007 and 2014, the Canada Social Transfer and the Canada Health Transfer each had a small equalization formula in their allocation as well, in addition to this official equalization program. So after 2007, 2014, these 2 transfers changed to equal per capita allocation. So this created some problem. This equal per capita allocation of transfers means that some of the less wealthy province, like the Atlantica province, now has a lower capacity to spend on healthcare education. However, it's difficult to change this, what Andrew said, already politicized equalization program due to the natural resource difference. So how can we make this entire transfer system more equitable without changing the equalization program? So we proposed to change this Canada Health Transfer formula from equal per capita allocation to needs-based allocation. What do we mean by needs-based allocation? Needs could be anything. Means if a province have a higher spending needs on healthcare or education, then they should receive a higher per capita amount of transfer. So in terms of Canada Health Transfer, the largest transfer, we propose age and the location should be taken into account. So for example, Atlantica province, Quebec, and British Columbia have a much older age profile in their population. So their per capita health expenditure is higher than the other province, the needs. So then those provinces should receive a higher per capita Canada Health Transfer. So we take this statistic of age distribution into account in this allocation of Canada Health Transfer. So this makes this allocation of the transfer system more equitable across the province without changing equalization, and also address the expenditure part sides of this equalization formula. So this is consistent with what Australia is doing. So Andre mentioned the governance of Australia. They have the Commonwealth Commission. They actually evaluate both tax capacity difference and all kinds of expenditure needs, location, age, everything else. So we want to use this to move towards that direction. In summary, we think if we want to study equalization or any other program, we have to treat these transfers as a system to be able to have a more complete picture of fiscal federalism in Canada.
Thank you very much, Hai-Jen. Now we move to warm Toronto. Look at him, in the short sleeves. I think it's pretty warm in Toronto today. Certainly warmer in Saskatoon. So, yeah, well, it's still summer there. Here it's fall. So it's all yours, Greg.
Well, thank you very much. It is hot and humid here, and I apologize for my apparel, but I can't stand it any other way. So, and I really do appreciate being able to join you by video. Although I can't see all of you, I know that many of my old colleagues are in the audience, both in Saskatoon and Regina, so hello. I'm also acutely aware that I'm the last person standing between you and wine, so I will not be very long. I'm going to talk about three different dimensions. I'm going to talk about the substantive dimension in terms of the future, the process dimension, and I will end on the issue of the federal role in terms of all of this. On the substantive, just looking at equalization alone, as has already been mentioned, the question is whether there's going to be any revision of the formula, and that's a very tough one to predict. But you will note that over its history, as we talk about in the book, there have been minor revisions to the equalization formula. There's been an evolution. But the basic philosophy of trying to estimate the actual tax capacity of provinces, while that is not necessarily an approach that is favored by economists in general, it is the approach that's favored by public administrators in Canada, and it's the one that they have always seemed to be most comfortable with. So it's highly unlikely that there's going to be a major change in the methodology of equalization, but there will be revisions, and these will center, as they have for a number of years, on the issue of resource revenues. And we have a compromise in place now between recognizing and not recognizing resource revenues as part of the picture. And there will be debate. Ultimately, it will be up to the federal government to decide. And keep in mind, as we mentioned, this is a federal program that comes entirely out of the tax revenues of the federal government. So it has a legitimate right to make that decision. But there will be revisions. Would expect that there would be revisions upwards in terms of taking into consideration resource revenues. But of course, that is opposed by the resource-rich provinces, always has been. The second aspect that Hai-Jen touched on is I think that in the past, these have been viewed entirely separate, equalization from the Canada Health Transfer and the Canada Social Transfer by the federal government. Provinces, however, tend to lump these together because of the way in which they roll into the general revenue funds. And I would predict that there will be probably more of a systems approach taken in the future by the federal government and the Federal Department of Finance. On process, this is the most interesting dimension, I think. In the past, while the federal government has at times received information from the provinces, even gone as far as to consult on discrete issues on equalization, it has generally made the decisions on equalization on its own, without engaging in what I would call an extensive federal, provincial, territorial negotiation. That has not been the trajectory of the Canada Health Transfer and the Canada Social Transfer when you look at the history. In fact, these in recent decades have been subject to major federal, provincial, territorial negotiations. In the recent past, that trend has, in a sense, been reversed a little bit. Well, it started actually before the Harper government, but in particular, the Harper government decided it would make decisions unilaterally on the issue of the Canada Health and Transfer in particular. It made those decisions unilaterally in the Canada Social Transfer as well, but that received much less attention. This was, of course, in the teeth of considerable provincial territorial opposition. I would say outrage at the time. But we would note that the Trudeau government has continued this. There was no major negotiation over the revision of the Canada Health Transfer. There was an attempt to have a discussion. When that discussion did not go in the direction that Ottawa wanted, instead it resorted to a series of bilateral health deals with the provinces, and basically a unilateral decision to continue the Canada Health Transfer in a particular form. If I was to make any prediction on this, I would say it is likely that there is going to be on the next round some kind of federal, provincial, territorial discussion and negotiation on the future of both transfers. It is consistent with the longer-term trend in this area. And it is likely that the provinces are going to figure out a way to get leverage on the issue to force the negotiation. In other words, I think that they've learned from recent experience. The premiers will regroup, their bureaucracies will provide the kind of advice that will provide the leverage or generate the leverage that will force a federal, provincial, territorial meeting. That said, there's no obligation, so this isn't in any way a secure prediction, but I think that's likely to be the case. In terms of the federal role in this area, to end, I think that, it is possible that in the future you could have a federal government that would be elected that would be ideologically opposed to equalization and could get rid of equalization. In some ways, you could say the Harper government was opposed to equalization, and maybe if it had another term in office, it might have begun to move in that direction. But there's something that would prevent any government from doing that, and that is the fact that equalization is part of the Constitution of Canada, and it receives the protection of the Constitution, and that makes it difficult for any government, irrespective of its ideological proclivities or its beliefs concerning the impact of equalization, to really change or eradicate this program. So in that sense, I think equalization is on pretty firm footing because of that constitutional protection. So I hope that you all enjoy the wine. I wish I could be there to join you. I would have a couple of glasses myself. And I wish you all the best.